It is not a meaningful process. It's a process based on the desires of Donald Trump to try and, very laudable, to try and end this terrible war, but not actually based on reality.
That's our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, who is in Paris watching a summit of European leaders and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Are they any closer to getting a peace deal or a peacekeeping force? We'll find out on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly we will be chatting to the Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride, and I suspect there may be a trademark newscast quiz at some point. Listen to find out. But first of all, we're going to cross to Paris because Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has been there meeting Emmanuel Macron, other leaders, including Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. They put a big arm around him and gave him a really quite big budget welcome. But is this just to make themselves feel better? And actually, the US, Europe, Ukraine and Russia are all still quite a long way apart. Let's find out, because Jeremy Bowen, our international editor, is there in Paris and has been speaking to lots of the people involved. Hello, Jeremy.
Hey, hello.
Right, lots to get.
With you.
Well, good to see you. Lots to get through in terms of what's been happening in Paris. Let's start with an update on the coalition of the willing, as Keir Starmer calls it, the European effort to provide some kind of peacekeeping or reassurance military force if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. What do we know about how the coalition's getting on?
Well, first of all, of course, there isn't a ceasefire, so it is something of a theoretical exercise, but of course they'd say they are planning for the future. Well, Messrs. Zelensky, Macron of France, Starmer of the UK have all declared themselves very satisfied with everything that they discussed. I went to the news conference that the Prime Minister did in the sumptuous surroundings of the British Embassy in Paris, a fantastic palace that they live in, and he said there that at the meeting all the leaders were saying they've never known Europe feeling so strong and full of resolve. But it has to be said that this process still has not really delivered that much that is tangible. No security guarantees. As far as we know, no country has offered to join Britain and France in potentially sending physical, real-life, living, breathing troops. So there's a long way to go. And don't forget as well that the Americans have been absolutely disparaging about it. You know, in the sort of the torrent of anti-European invective that has been coming across the Atlantic. At the weekend, there was that interview done by the right-wing American podcaster Tucker Carlson, who spoke to Steve Witkoff, Trump's super envoy. He's also envoy to the Middle East as well as to the Russia-Ukraine war. And he absolutely dissed this coalition, the willing. I mean, he said it was a pose, it was a posture by Keir Starmer, who just wanted to sound like Winston Churchill. He was very, very slighting about it. But despite all of that, they say they're very happy with the way things are going.
And did Starmer, when he did his statement, respond to any of those criticisms by Steve Witkoff?
Not in so many words, though they were put to him. I mean, the thing I said to him by the time I got to my turn was, look, listening to you and listening to the Americans and to Donald Trump and to Witkoff and the rest of them, it's almost like you're looking at two different wars in two different worlds. Starmer was saying things like increase the military pressure on Putin, make sure there's a deadline, peace through strength, no relaxation of sanctions. And of course, Zelensky cheers all this on because he very much feels the same way about it, as does Macron. Very different signals coming from Washington. A mild remark by Starmer after the Russians imposed conditions retroactively on the agreement they were supposed to have made to have a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, when they actually linked it to a very substantial lifting of sanctions, including rejoining one of their significant banks, rejoining the SWIFT network, which would give them a door into legitimate international trade and finance. And so the Americans are still going pretty much softly on Russia, and the Europeans are not. But when I put that to the Prime Minister, he said, oh, no, we're all pointing in the same direction. Mr. Trump really wants to have a peace agreement. Well, everybody wants to have a peace agreement, but the problem is that there are very different versions of peace. And for Putin, and I put this to the Prime Minister as well, and again he didn't really answer it. His idea of peace is either military victory or Ukrainian capitulation, neither of which, of course, they're after or would agree to.
And just picking up on what you said there, Jeremy. So, is it the case then that the negotiations that happened in Saudi Arabia earlier in the week, which produced two texts, a joint US-Russian one and a joint Ukrainian one, which sketched out this idea of a ceasefire in the Black Sea to allow commercial shipping and to stop military activity in the Black Sea, that is absolutely not happening. And the main reason it's not happening is because after those statements were put out, Russia said, we want relief on sanctions and access to the global banking system. That's actually the sequence of what happened, and that's where we are now?
Yeah, because after they had their meeting in Saudi Arabia, the Kremlin put out this statement. So now, after this morning, we know that Starmer, Macron, Zelensky had already said it, are absolutely against any relaxation of sanctions. So the big question is, where does this process go? And actually, back to that point I was trying to make about these parallel worlds, another point I made to the Prime Minister was, I said, look, this is all coming from Donald Trump's actually ridiculous assertion during the campaign that he could solve it in one day. Then that went up to maybe 100 days. And of course, Trump now says, well, I was being a little bit theoretical about all of that. And it's because they all are responding to Donald Trump. It's not as if there was a view on either side that they could get something good about on Russian or Ukrainian side, get anything good out of negotiations. Why? Because the two sides are so massively far apart. Zelensky, after the bust-up in the Oval Office, is in a position where he had to agree to this 30-day unconditional ceasefire, partly because Trump insisted, and he had to get back into his good books, and he had, most importantly, and he said this to me when I interviewed him last night, he said, look, we had to get intelligence information back to us from the Americans. Because without that, we are in big trouble. And that was basically the price. He says that pretty openly. And then on the other hand, yeah, Putin's going along with what the Americans say, but bringing in, as everybody predicted, loads of conditions. And when push comes to shove, putting in a massive condition, which is that the supporters of Ukraine, essentially, particularly in Europe, agree to blow a massive hole through the sanctions regime just in return for a temporary ceasefire in the Black Sea, which isn't going to happen. So my question is, where does this go from here? How do they try and get this going as a meaningful process? My assertion would be, my conclusion would be, it is not a meaningful process. It's a process based on the desires of Donald Trump to try and, I mean, very laudable, to try and end this terrible war, but not actually based on reality.
And Jeremy, you mentioned your chat with Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday evening in very grand surroundings. It was like a big production number that seemed to involve lots of other European broadcasters as well. What was your read of Zelensky at the moment?
Well, just before we get into that, I need to tell you a bit about the background to that, because the European Broadcasting Union, which we all in Europe are members of, and we exchange material, they arranged it. And I mean, it sounds a bit like a joke. There was a French woman, a German woman, an Estonian man, and a Welshman, and we met a Ukrainian. And it was in a very grand surroundings of this extraordinary museum looking down on the Eiffel Tower, which had been, in honor of Zelensky, they made the lights yellow and blue, and it was glittery and very, very striking. And of course, when we got there, the French immediately took us all out to lunch while this enormous, elaborate set was being built. And you know what I said to them, look, if this was the BBC organising this, you'd probably get a limp sandwich if you were lucky. But I have very nice Tornado Rossini. But anyway, I mean, as for Zelensky, he arrived, he was actually very upbeat, considering he's been under an awful lot of pressure. Now, why is that? I think it's because Macron and Starmer are showing him a lot of love. He came from the Élysée Palace, where he'd been talking to President Macron. After he finished with us, he went back to the palace for what he called a tete-a-tete dinner. So they're clearly getting on well and agreeing with each other about the way this should go ahead. But there is something really fundamentally difficult at the heart of it, which is actually, in a way, Trump was correct to say that this is going nowhere, because under Biden, the Americans gave them more or less enough to keep going, the Ukrainians, but not enough to win, because Biden was very worried about Russia under pressure losing, maybe using nuclear weapons and risks of World War III, all of that. And so maybe, you know, the argument is that Trump is being realistic. Come on, guys, you have to make a deal, and if necessary, Ukraine, you have to give up some land to the Russians, which is something that the Ukrainians absolutely do not want to do. But so, I mean, I think the challenge diplomatically is to try to plot a course, or a decision has to be taken about where this is going. It is all very well for the Europeans to say, we're going to be with you all the way. But if they can't back it up with something very tangible that either forces Russia to make concessions or builds up the muscles of the Ukrainians considerably, then frankly, it's all a bit of a empty, performative exercise.
Well, my sense as an outside observer is the diplomatic effort is maybe shifting a little bit away from building up the coalition of the willing militarily and shifting into sending the message to Donald Trump that Putin is, in the words of Keir Starmer, just filibustering here, and everyone is just trying to ram that message home to the Americans that they are, in their eyes, in danger of being played here. That seems like the pendulum has shifted away from a military build up to try and force some negotiations to basically just pressurizing the Americans. I mean, just one last question, and it's a bit unrelated to this, but our colleague Mark Lowen, who's been in Turkey for the last couple of days covering the protests against President Erdogan's government there, he was basically detained and has been deported from the country as a threat to public order. Is that the sort of thing you've ever experienced somewhere in the world? Have you been kicked out of a country before?
Yeah, I have, and it's not the kind of country necessarily that President Erdogan of Turkey would like to be associated with. I was booted out of Saddam Hussein's Iraq for for actually saying something in a news report that they didn't like. I spoke about Saddam's network of coercion and repression, which was, you know, extremely well developed, but you weren't meant to mention it. Well, I mentioned it, and I got, they said, you've got to get to the border in 4 hours, and it was a 8-hour drive to get there. The poor old sound recordist had never been there before, thought we were for the chop. I said, don't worry, it's going to be fine. Yeah, I've been booted I was kicked out of Afghanistan once. One thing about being a foreign correspondent is arrest and expulsion is definitely an occupational hazard. But, you know, joking apart, what happened to Mark, and has happened before to many hundreds, actually, of Turkish journalists, in terms of being locked up, they're not clearly being expelled, says all you need to know about the authoritarian regime in Turkey and its attitude to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of reporting, because, you know, Mark Lowen is a very good, fair journalist. I mean, listen to his reporting. He's been doing some brilliant stuff out of Turkey. And the fact that they're worried about it means, frankly, it means they're scared of the truth.
Jeremy, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great to be on the program again.
No, I'm a great believer in the day after the spring statement is just as interesting as the day the Chancellor delivers the spring statement. And today is... Now, I'm a great believer in the day after the spring statement is just as interesting as the day when the Chancellor delivers the spring statement. And that's just as true today as it is every year. But we're going to chat over now with somebody who was there, eyeball to eyeball with Rachel Reeves as she updated the nation's finances. It is the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, who is returning to Newscast. Shadow Chancellor, hello.
Hello, Adam.
And Chris is down the line at Westminster, although we're looking at him in a big screen.
Hello, both. Hi.
It's like watching you on TV, Chris.
Oh, no.
Anyway, for people who are listening, Chris is in a big screen in the corner. Right, first question. I think last time you were on Newscast, Mel, you were actually in the cabinet. So you were on the other side of the House of Commons.
Yeah.
What's it like being in kind of I wouldn't call it the loser side. But
it's going from being in a huge department. So I was at DWP that I was running with 90,000 people and loads of civil servants sorting all sorts of things out for you, to kind of guerrilla warfare, where you're kind of in a much smaller team. But, we're there to hold the government to account, and that's what we're doing. And I think we're doing it very effectively. And I think you saw that yesterday, actually, around the so-called spring statement or emergency budget.
What is this whole emergency budget thing you're going with? Is that kind of revenge for the
No, not at all. No, look, if you stand up in front of the House of Commons and you just update the House of Commons on the latest OBR forecast,
which she did,
then that is a spring statement, which indeed she did, and it made pretty sobering reading. That's one thing, and I would call that a statement. But if you're going to have to intervene to regenerate all the lost headroom that you've lost since the last fiscal event, then to me that becomes an emergency.
Do you know what? To me, this sounds like
that's the difference.
This now sounds like you've just coined the Stride rule, which is if you're a chancellor because you win the next election, if you want to make any changes to public spending outside a budget, you will call that a budget.
So no, I think it's different. If it's a little bit of tinkering around the edges, that's fine. But look, if you start off with 9.9 billion in headroom, which is what the chancellor had back in the autumn, and you lose all of that, right? And another 4.1 billion on top, and you therefore have to, as she did in her case, scrabble around to find savings in welfare and squeezing spending and all of those kind of things, then that is more than just simply standing up and cantering through the latest forecast from the OBR. I think that's the difference.
I wonder, Mel, because I'm conscious for some newscasters, some of the terms that we're throwing around might seem a little sort of alien about headroom and fiscal rules and the Office for Budget Responsibility and all the rest of it. But here is the Chancellor sort of setting out, her own self-imposed rules around trying to project a sense of economic credibility, and then working out what measures that she's proposing, what reaction they provoke from the forecast of the OBR in terms of how they're scored, to use the sort of Westminster vernacular, how much money they think things can save or how much economic growth it might generate. I'm wondering on your critique and your labelling of the statement as an emergency budget. At the core of it, then, should she? If you'd been in her seat in October or indeed yesterday, and I know you'd have had a very different approach to tax and many other things, is the bottom line of what you're saying is that there should have been, a chancellor should be leaving a lot more headroom? Oh,
undoubtedly. Okay.
By what sort of magnitude do you think?
Well, I'm not going to put a number on it, and I haven't been sitting in the Treasury. but look, but you asked the question. I haven't given you an answer, Chris, which is absolutely. Look what happened to the headroom last time. As they say, she lost the whole lot and more. She's now put together the same headroom, the same number, and taken a lot of difficult choices in order to do that. At the same time as saying that we live in an uncertain world, and there are all sorts of things out there that may be very serious headwinds to the economy. And this is why the IFS, for example, is saying that they would be surprised if she can get through to the autumn without having to come back and maybe raise taxes, for example.
Yeah.
So, there's not enough headroom.
I wonder if there's almost, just to sort of reverse the psychology a bit, that perhaps the world is so wildly unpredictable at the moment that even if you had, double, treble the amount of headroom, it could still be blown out of the water by whatever Donald Trump says a week on Wednesday.
Well, look, there are some scenarios that you could conjure, and it's not even go there, but sort of world events that could kick off and happen that, of course, mean that all bets are off. But in a sort of realistic kind of assumptions about the kind of buffeting that the economy might get going forward, I don't think what she has is enough. My proof point on that, to some degree, would be what has happened to her previous headroom, which was clearly not enough. And I'm not sure that certainly people like the IFS and others are going to have, cast iron confidence that she's going to be able to get through on the headroom that she's put together.
I'm trying to get a rough ballpark of where you think her headroom should be. Should it be 15 billion, 20 billion, 25?
So, as I say, I don't think I'm going to get drawn into giving a precise number other than to observe that, history is a guide to the future. We've seen what this Chancellor has done. She gambled on a thin sliver of headroom last time round, then went out, talked down the economy, loaded up businesses with tax, got into big spending territory that we're used to, the Labour Party of old, if you like, which was an inflationary pressure, kept interest rates higher for longer, had a knock-on consequence for the national debt and the servicing of that. And those things all combined basically killed growth stone dead and destroyed our headroom. And I'm not full of confidence that this Chancellor is going to get us through to the autumn, given the same amount of headroom as she had before.
Wow.
And survive, and that headroom surviving.
We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see.
An exam question that we'll see the answer to.
Yeah, let's put this in a little time capsule. So in a couple of years' time, we're going to be spending something as a country like £110 billion a year just servicing government debt because of the pile of debt that's been built up over the last few decades.
Yeah.
Do you take some responsibility for that? Because a huge chunk of it was built up during the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look. Let's look at that because it's a really fair question. So, if you go back to 2010, when we first appeared on the scene in the coalition government, we inherited, if you remember, a huge deficit. It was about 160 billion, right? And that's the excess of spending over tax receipts, effectively, from the then last Labour government. It took time to get that deficit down. And so, by definition, given that the deficit adds to the debt, the debt was increasing as the proportion of GDP. But when we got to about 2015, actually, we started to bring that debt as a proportion of GDP down. It was on a downward trajectory until we hit COVID. And then, of course, it spiked up, as it did in many other countries, in our main competitor countries. We spent about £400 billion supporting the economy through COVID, mainly supporting jobs. People said we would be going into a world where we'd see mass unemployment like we've never seen in our lifetime.
In retrospect, was that too much?
Well, I think there'll be endless debate. I think the most important overriding thing is that, whether it was a bit too much or a bit too little or whatever it was, the reality is that intervention spared us from mass unemployment. Now, you've got to remember that what COVID did was shrank the UK economy by 10% overnight. It hadn't had that kind of treatment since the Great Frost of 1709. So that was a cataclysmic event, and a Conservative government stepped up to the plate. But we did spend a lot of money doing it, and that's why debt as a proportion of GDP shot up at that point.
Okay, so you say
and also cost of living support through the inflation caused by Ukraine.
Well, okay, you say there's a debate about whether that was the right level. Was that the right level? Where would you be in the debate?
I look, put it this way. If the question became, if you inherited in 2010 a colossal deficit up at around 10% of GDP, about 160 billion or thereabouts, would you have been able to have done much other than see debt increasing? I doubt it. If you had been struck by an externality like COVID that shrank the economy by that much, in the terms that we've discussed, would you have been able to avoid it, protecting the economy without spending any money? I doubt it. So I think, you can talk about a bit around the scale here and the scale there, but the reality is there are strong reasons why.
So you must have a bit of sympathy there with Rachel Reeves having to manage this situation because you ran up lots of the debt.
No.
Well, what was she meant to do, get rid of it overnight?
No, because the problems that we have had were around COVID and then the inflationary pressures of Ukraine and Russia. And all
which built up a stock of debt she's having to deal with.
Yes, indeed. But the problem but if you look at the problem she got in losing the headroom, a large part of that, in fact, most of it, is to do with that servicing cost on the debt.
Yeah, debt which you ran up.
Correct. but she has added to it by this great spending splurge, 70 billion of spending a year across the forecast. And secondly, by doing that and also raising national insurance, which has a knock-on consequence for prices, because businesses push them into higher prices, inflation was higher, and therefore interest rates are higher, and her mismanagement of the economy and the loss of confidence in that by the markets, meaning the government borrowing was going up at the same time.
Interest rates have come down three times since she's been Chancellor.
Yeah, but it should have been faster than that. If you hadn't been stoking up inflationary pressures in the economy, interest rates would have come down quicker. So it's no good just trumpeting 3 cuts. It should have been more and faster.
I wonder, Mel,
and that was on her watch.
Understood.
I wonder, Mel, what would be in your view, a sustainable or justifiable amount of cost as far as debt servicing is concerned?
Well, you want to get it down clearly as much as you can. I mean, one of the
But again,
reasons,
by what sort of? I want to get some sort of sense of scale.
If you look across the international scene or history, there have been times in our history where debt has been up at 250%. That was in the Second World War. You look at Germany, it's about 60% of GDP, and that's why they're in a much stronger position when it comes to borrowing on at least that.
Is that the kind of number we need to be getting back down to?
We do need to be getting it down. But look, you're now asking me questions about the future, which I think do play into that space of we've got to, as a party, look at the whole totality of the macro economy. And we've got to answer actually a fundamental question, which is how do you get growth and productivity right up? You know, if you looked at trend growth up to the great financial crisis and we just continue that as it was, we'd be 25% bigger as an economy. So how do you do that? And things like debt and the size of debt and getting onto it are all part of going through that kind of analysis. So I'm not going to pluck figures out of the air, other than to say we have got to get debt down.
The changes to the disability benefits that everyone's been talking about for the last week or so, and we got another update on them yesterday, and we also got the impact assessment about how much they will actually affect people who receive these benefits. Are you signed up to this plan of tweaking the personal independence payments in this way, and the disability bit of universal credit?
What I am signed up to, and I believe I delivered when I was Secretary of State at Work and Pensions, is what I would call principled welfare reform. And what I mean by that is something where some deep thinking has been carried out, and there is a very clear, logical plan as to what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it, in a way that is both fair to the taxpayer and getting the welfare bill down, because it is spiralling ever skyward, and that needs to be gripped, absolutely. And secondly, is fair to those people who depend upon welfare, so that you protect the most vulnerable. I am not happy with what the government has done, because if you are to have a principled welfare approach, you cannot rush that. You cannot have a situation where the Labour Party has nothing about personal independence payments in their manifesto. It's not mentioned once. They come into office, they pussyfoot around the whole issue. Why? Because it's deeply divisive amongst their ranks. And then the Chancellor, from the top of the sinking ship, suddenly shouts out, hey, I need some money to shore things up. And then they all run around and suddenly cobble something together. That is not the best way to approach welfare. You end up with the worst of both worlds. Firstly, you don't actually make the level of savings that you would get from a more thought-through fundamental reform. And secondly, you end up with far more hard edges, which is just frankly unfair.
So what should they have done instead in terms of
the
process?
So we had already, to take PIP, we had already consulted on PIP when I was Secretary of State. It was one of those areas that we were moving into in terms of further reforms. Within that consultation was more fundamental reform of PIP. I don't know how much detail we want to go into now, but you want a benefit that is highly targeted in a cost-efficient way on the people that really need the help, rather than a blunt benefit that tends to give people support where maybe financially they don't need it, so they might just need an aid and appliance. They might even be getting from the NHS or the local authority.
So you'd means test it, would you?
No, I'm not talking about means testing there at all. I'm just talking about what PIP is. PIP is a payment that is at least a part compensation for the additional costs of disability. And if the additional costs, the point that I'm making, were, for example, some aid or appliance, maybe a walking stick or something that helps you, handle your kettle in a particular way or whatever, then that may be a one-off need that's not too expensive. Rather different from a rather more complicated need. For example, somebody may have a mental health condition, much more complex in terms of the problem. So what I wanted to move to was a system that was much more targeted on getting the right resources given the nature.
So somebody might get a one-off PIP-style payment for a thing that helps them, and somebody else might get continuing PIP-style payments.
Or support. So the mental health example, it may be far more helpful to somebody to get decent support and help for their condition, rather than transfer payments every year for many years.
Had you got to the stage of working out how much that would save from the budget? And bear in mind, the savings we talk about here are quite weird, because the number of people getting it is going to go up. It's just that it'll cost less
across the piece. If you look at health related and disability related benefits, if you were to not see any increase in the number of people that are receiving health related benefits between now and the end of the forecast period, if it was just that cohort number was kept static, you would save, I think it's around, probably now the numbers move as time goes on, but about 15 billion pounds. If you were to get that number back to its pre-COVID level, which perhaps we should be able to do that, you'd be looking at a saving every year, this is, of well in excess of 30 billion pounds. So there are very large amounts of money, much of it driven by actually not so much going back from where we are today, but just making sure that the ever spiralling profile, the numbers of people on these benefits, doesn't keep going up and up and up.
And how do you do that?
Well, PIP, I've explained that you'd look at fundamental reform. With the work capability assessments reforms that I brought in, which saved £5 billion across the forecast, and that was scored by the OBR, would have led to, the OBR said, 450,000 fewer people going on to long-term disability and sickness benefits. That was to do with the way in which the gateway into that benefit actually operated, and to make sure that it was more fit for purpose, not least because a lot of people with mobility issues are able to work from home, which is a much more prevalent option than it would have been over a decade ago, when the way that
but isn't
work capability
this government doing a lot of that on a
properly?
But isn't this government doing a lot of that? The stuff that you just sketched out there.
What the government has done with the health element to UC is to freeze the actual rate of the benefit, and indeed to halve it for those newly going on to that benefit, and then to freeze it thereafter. And this
while
is my
increasing
point.
the basic level of universal credit.
Yes, the standard allowance. But let me just make the point that what I think that demonstrates is my point about rushing it. Because if you rush it, you don't fundamentally reform. What you simply do is you say, well, freeze that benefit or cut it, which is an incredibly blunt way to go about trying to square what I call that principled reform, which is to be fair to the taxpayer, but equally to be fair to people who are often quite vulnerable.
I suppose in that scenario, Mel, how you wrestle with again, that sort of point of principle, and I know the principles can be in tension with this kind of thing, between those who are existing recipients of something, who, from what you're saying, broadly speaking, might continue to be recipients in broadly the same way, versus somebody who could be of very similar circumstance, but only required or sought the help of the state at a later moment, who was getting significantly less.
Are you referring there, Chris, to the new world that the government is taking us into? That there are two different rates depending on whether you're
partly that, because the same critique. Yeah, I mean, partly that because the same critique would apply to that scenario. But I was just thinking about your scenario where you were talking about the existing collection of people, the cohort of people who are current recipients, versus what you might be able to do and how much money you could save if you squeeze the flow of people into that cohort.
Yeah. So I think the reason, if I can try and interpret your question, I think the reason why the government has done something different for those who already get the benefit as opposed to those that may in the future get the benefit is that it is clearly more difficult to change arrangements for somebody who's already getting something than it is to change what somebody gets when they didn't know what they would have got in the first place.
Is it fair to you that those two people, that two people of very similar circumstances could get something very different?
I think not. And this is my exact point. The reason why they've ended up doing that, for example, is it has been rushed. So you have to crack the problem of how you treat everybody equally with equal circumstance. But we're actually moving into a world where those that are on the benefit are going to be treated differently from those that are about to go on the benefit.
Isn't that what you were advocating by squeezing the number of people who are going on to the benefits as opposed to...
But I wasn't changing the actual level of the benefit, was I? I wasn't changing what people would receive when they're on there. I was looking at making changes to the gateway into that benefit to recognise the fact that with support, a lot of people can actually, for example, work from home. Okay. So that's the distinction. And of course, those that have the benefit would then be reassessed in time, and they would then go through a different process to assess whether they would still get the benefit. But everybody would be treated equally in that way.
And I hate to be one of those people that says, "Oh, it's very complicated," but I mean, the benefit system is just complicated. That's a fact. How long did it take you to get your head around the benefit system when you became the Working Pensions Secretary?
That is a brilliant question.
And also, did you ever fully get your head around it?
Well, do you ever fully understand everything totally? No. I think to answer your question, undoubtedly, it did take me a number of months before I totally felt that I kind of understood the terrain. I knew exactly. I knew early on, broadly. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to work out the broad things that I had to do in that department. And the one thing I would add, I think, is that if you're to deal with complexity and to deal with a vast system that is difficult to rearrange and change and reform, is pick your targets. So don't try and change the whole world. Try and hone in on the big things that really matter, and really go for those and try and move the dial. So my reforms of work capability assessment was a big process. It took quite a long time to do, and I think it delivered, well, as the OBR said, almost 500,000 people not going onto those benefits and having the opportunity to go into work, I think was a major achievement. But that was the approach that I took.
So interesting. Right, let's wrap up quickly with a quick little quiz for you.
Oh,
so I remember last time, yeah, classic.
Right.
We haven't done a quiz for a while. So,
Yeah.
but last time you were on, we had quite a long chat about all your cricketing metaphors that you. Like
Oh, we did, didn't we?
And you schooled me in like cricket.
Dead batting.
Exactly, and I've been dining out on them
Caught in
ever
the
since.
slips. Or, I can't remember.
But what I've noticed lately is I think maybe your crown as the world's biggest user of sporting metaphors and politics has been usurped by Mark Carney.
Oh, yeah.
In Canada, because I've noticed every time
What's
he appears,
using? Fiscal terms.
no, every time he appears, he does a little ice hockey metaphor.
Oh, he does. That's
So we
right.
thought we'd see how good your knowledge of ice hockey metaphors is.
Puck. That's
So-
the answer.
okay, well, this is
That's
gonna-
the answer to the first one. The answer to the second question is right.
Hang on, you don't make us mark your own
The third
homework.
one is go on.
Right, so we've got a couple of clips of Mark Carney's recent appearances, and I'm going to see if you can interpret these.
What am I looking at? Which screen?
We're just going to play it. It's audio.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you don't need to look at it. You don't need to look at it.
Right.
So this is a video he did at the weekend with Mike Myers, the Canadian comedian, and they are an ice
Austin
hockey.
Powers.
Austin Powers, I meant,
yeah,
and,
baby.
and Shrek. And this is what the two of them said, and we'll see if you can interpret this ice hockey metaphor.
Okay, right.
Wow. You really are Canadian. Yeah. But let me ask you, Mr. Prime Minister, will there always be a Canada?
There will always be a Canada.
All right. Elbows up.
Elbows up.
What do you reckon elbows up means?
I think that means kind of good news. That's great. That's positive. We're going for it. We're not messing around. We're up for the fight.
It's actually a reference to the style of play by a player called Gordie Howe, which is tough and defensive.
I think that's what I was saying.
Let's get the
by and
OBR
large,
onto this.
Okay, I didn't name check him, and I'll do that next time. But yeah, okay.
No, right. Okay, here's the second one. And this is from his acceptance speech when he actually got the leadership of his party.
Okay.
And this is him talking about the US tariffs.
We didn't ask for this fight. We didn't ask for this fight. But Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans...
Dropping the gloves. What do we think that means?
Ready when somebody else drops the gloves. So it sounds like when somebody drops the gloves, they're inviting you into a contest of some sort. Is it?
Correct.
Yeah, I just defined that from
Okay, that's
so that's 2 out of 2, right?
No, that's 1 out of 2.
No, that's
right.
You're being ungenerous. I'm not
Here's-
coming on again. If you're going to cheat on the quiz, I'm not
It's
coming
not.
on again.
The listeners can decide if this has been a fair
All right.
match.
Okay, all right.
Right, here's the third and final one. So this is him during the campaign for the leadership, and this is Mark Carney comparing himself to the then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
I'm a very different person than the current Prime Minister. I was born in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. My parents were teachers. I grew up in Edmonton. I'm a goalie. He's a snowboarder. You know, there's lots and lots of differences.
What's the implication of the different sports there?
A goalie and a wow. And he's a snowboarder.
Yeah.
He's not referring.
Trudeau is a snowboarder.
He's not referring to positions played within ice hockey.
So actually, this is not really ice hockey.
It's not ice hockey.
Well, it is ice because he's saying he's a goalie. So Carney's a goalie.
Yeah, okay.
Trudeau is a snowboarder.
It's a snowboarder. Okay, I'd say, is it about being a team player as opposed to a loner on your snowboard?
That is an interesting
goalie's
interpretation, but actually,
doing the bit for the team.
what he really meant was that people who snowboard are posh, and people who play ice hockey are more
okay,
normal,
okay.
which some people might think is a quite strange thing for Mark Carney to suggest
Yes,
as a member of
quite
the global
interesting.
elite.
Well, indeed.
Well, I'm going to
Indeed.
give you
What a story.
1.5 out of 3.
Right. Well, I might come back on in that case. I only might. All
And
right.
we need to find a world leader who's got a love of sporting metaphors that we can test you on.
right.
Last question, and this is a mad question to end on. Do you think the OBR has got too much power?
I think that we need to have an independent forecaster. I don't think the Chancellor should be marking her own homework.
Like
and
you
if
just
you
did
think
with
about
that
what's
quiz.
going on, yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
No, I think when it comes, no OBRs, keep them out of the quiz scene, right? I feel very strongly about that. No, but I think when it comes to what's happened over the last few days, would we really want the Treasury to be in charge of marking its own homework? I don't think we would, but I do think we need to look at the OBR in terms of how it scores things, how it operates. I think there needs to be some thinking around that, and a number of the other arms length bodies and institutions.
What, so thinking around
the
whether...
PRA, the FCA, all these things we need to think about and have a look at.
Yeah, on the specifics of the OBR and the scoring, this is a very sort of nerdy Westminster type thought. But I mean, should they be doing more to, I don't know, show their workings about how they've concluded that, actually, perhaps the government can deliver its house building plans, or actually it doesn't think that they can save as much money on welfare as they thought the government thought they could?
Yeah, I think potentially. I mean, as you know, the scorecard is developed through an iterative process with the Treasury, so they will be poring over the details between them. Now, whether more of that should be made public, I think, is an interesting idea.
I'm trying to work out, do you want its wings clipped a bit? Is that the thrust of what you're saying?
I don't think wings clipped in terms of making sure there is an independent body that is trusted to mark the Chancellor's homework and come up with those forecasts.
Shrivelled a bit?
Well, I wouldn't say shriveled a bit. I think one... OK, let me to get a bit nerdy. So they have, in this round of forecasts, decided to give some impact on economic growth due to planning reforms.
Yeah.
Now, that actually is a bit of a shift in the OBR. And one of the frustrations I had with the OBR around the labour market was if you went to them with an intervention and said, look, we're going to do this really innovative new thing that hasn't been done before, they said, well, we're not going to score it. Well, why not? Because there's no evidence that it works. Well, yeah, of course there isn't, because we're doing things differently. The old things don't work, and that's why we're doing differently. So unless you could find, unless you were doing basically incrementally the same thing that you did before, or you could find some other country that was doing exactly what you're suggesting, it was difficult to get things scored. So I think this idea of scoring, and in that area of the OBR's activity, is definitely an area where probably some thinking might be required. But I think the principle of the OBR is an important one.
And I have to confess, I loved our chat about the OBR as much as I loved the quiz. But that's how we roll on Newscast. Mel, thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Lovely to see you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening, and to everyone who's been on it. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.